We're joined by Father Jacob Siemens, priest of St. Theodore and St. Tylo's Orthodox Church in Cardiff, Wales. He edited Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy, wrote the Christology of Theodore of Tarsus, and most recently published a catechetical work, Orthodox Basics. Welcome to Forms, Father.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Before we begin, I thought I'd ask you a personal question. I understand you've recently joined Notre Archevêché. So what brought you to Orthodoxy and Rue d'Arroux specifically?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and one that I actually get asked, not least because Rue de Roux's presence here in the UK is fairly minimal. In the first instance, Orthodoxy, because really I started to fall in love with it when I was first studying for the Anglican priesthood in Montreal back in the early and mid 1990s. I came from Winnipeg, Canada originally, where Orthodoxy is a presence. If you've ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, a lot of those people are actually Winnipeggers, believe it or not. And the north end of the city, it could be said, is dotted with onion domes because of the strong, particularly Ukrainian presence there. Some of which, of course, is Greek Catholic, as I understand well now, but at the time would have just seen all as a manifestation of an Eastern Christianity, which the majority of my friends would not have known much about. In any case, when I moved to Montreal to continue reading theology, as I say, in preparation for ordination, I was working at a bookstore. My manager was an Orthodox priest. And simply by being surrounded by both conversation and source material, i.e., many of the books that were being published by St. Vlad's, I became utterly enamored, and in fact started my exploration of moving into Orthodoxy as early as that. So after that, it was a journey through the Anglican Church, and at one point I made what I would describe as a significant mistake, thinking that I could have my cake and eat it by being Orthodox in communion with Rome. And so when I left the Anglican altar, it was for the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. But it not long thereafter became apparent that, well, I was deceived, whether by me or by circumstance, I don't know. That's for later discernment. But when that became clear, and I knew I had to move on, it was to Orthodoxy. So Rue de Roux beckoned simply because I spoke with he's currently on sick leave, but the dean for the archdiocese here in the United Kingdom. We were talking about developing some theological resources. At the end of the conversation, he asked how I was, and because at the time I was unhappily still a member of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I dumped it all on him. And he said, well, look, if you want to talk more, give me a ring. So I took him up on that, put it all to him again. And he spoke with Metropolitan Jean, who said, subject to all due diligence checks, he would be happy to receive me. And there's much more to it than that, but that's the happy story of how I came to not just be Orthodox, but a member of the Archdiocese.
I'm happy to have met you and have this connection. And I think going through your books, it was really interesting because a lot of the things that you're discussing and opening up and analyzing, etc., are issues that are critically important today. I mean, you have this
Mm.
book about catechism. How would you esteem the general state of Christian understanding of our own religion, both within the archdiocese and in the wider Christian world?
Oh gosh, I mean, this is probably one of the most fundamental questions we face from a missiological point of view, but equally just from a pastoral point of view. There is so much to know. And by that, I do not mean things to know in some dry, unspiritually informative way, but rather stuff to know that is fundamentally enriching to the life of prayer that is the Orthodox life. And people don't have that. I
Mm.
mean, I will say that I see it underpinning the life of, for example, our archdiocese better than I have seen it perhaps in past communities of which I've been a part, but knowing what we do and why we do it, knowing what underpins our faith in terms of, our fundamental experience of God, God as love, all of these things are so often missing. And I think it's why we become vulnerable, our young people especially, but people in general become vulnerable to the discouragement of the radical atheism we've seen in the Anglo world for the last 20 years. They become vulnerable to, um, uh, as we say in our Orthodox prayers, the noonday devil, but except that it lasts beyond noonday, right? It takes people away and sees them drift off into despondency. And it's something that I think can be best combated by uh, prayer and pedagogy together, by prayer and good teaching, which isn't a matter of simply rolling out the old list of propositions. I can't stress that enough. It's a matter of saying, what are your questions? Let's meet those questions and draw them out, look at their implications, and actually seek answers that are satisfying. I'm going to sound like I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but to me, that is the most important feature of the pastoral life because there is so much disingenuity, so much potential for simply telling people like it is without giving them a chance to stretch and exercise their own existential questions. And how much do we betray them when we do that? I mean, it's not good enough just to say that, oh, your loved one died. Say this prayer. Please, yes, say the prayer. But it is important to enter into that place where the person is when they suffer.
We don't have a lack of religious data, so to speak. We're all hooked into a 24/7 global database. We can
Yeah,
retrieve the data anytime. That's not the difficulty.
yeah, yeah, very much.
I think, turning towards your work on Saint Theodore of Tarsus, who, for those unfamiliar, is a 7th century Greek, particular influence in Great Britain and in Western, the far Western, I guess you would say, inheritance of Christianity. Part of his mission, as you expose in your book, had to do with dealing with a lot of errors that had cropped up in Britain. What was the condition of Britain when Theodore showed up?
It was really quite disparate. I mean, when you consider the fact that the Anglo-Saxon sort of part, what we call England very roughly, was divided into a number of kingdoms, some of which were more recently Christianized than others, but all of which had only been Christian, for the last 100 or so years. Amidst which you have this sort of Celtic settlement, which is which has inherited an earlier Christianity, likely brought there by the Roman presence earlier, and and with curious habits and orientations. So, for example, it was less episcopally oriented and more abbatially oriented, meaning more based on the monasteries and the monastic life. And this is probably nowhere more manifest than in the fact that the Synod of Whitby, which took place in 663, was even necessary. The Synod of Whitby, for those who don't know, was called by the Abbess Hilda. Whitby is in Yorkshire, an absolutely breathtaking place on the north coast, east coast of England. But she called the synod in order that the various ecclesiastics might come together and decide once and for all on a common date of Easter. And they went with, ultimately at the synod, they went with the Roman calculation as opposed to these various sort of local calculations. And so this is what Theodore sort of enters into. I mean, he arrives only 5 years after the synod. He immediately goes on a visitation of the land under his pastoral staff. He encounters, and I love this story, but somebody like Saint Chad, who was of dubious ordination because of the confusion around sort of Celtic practice versus continental Roman practice. And in their first encounter, Theodore is forced to depose him completely. To which Chad responds by saying, "Well, I'm glad you did that because I never thought I was worthy of being a bishop in the first place." Which Theodore responds to by saying, "In which case, you're the perfect bishop," and reordains him from
Mm.
ground up. So, you get this poor but humble man sort of stripped of orders and reinstated immediately. Sort of a wonderful and holy confusion, but one to which he has to bring all his administrative skill to bear in order to bring it into some semblance of order.
And I guess we should step back and say, who is Theodore of Tarsus? We're talking about somebody who's born, as I said, at the beginning of the seventh century in, the Levant, well, not the Levant, but in Cilicia,
Hmm.
and who's traveling in Edessa and Antioch, probably, and Constantinople and Rome, and is finally sent, because he's an expert in calendrical matters, because he's a holy monk, because he's wise and learned in various traditions, ends up being made bishop of this far flung corner of the world. What do you think his perception of his own mission was, based on all the reading you've done, and like subjectively, what would you take to
Well,
be his view?
I feel deep sympathy for him, and I don't know to what degree it's just pure projection. But I think actually, on some sound academic bases, I think there's good reason to think that he was a very human character who was just kind of an intellectual, kind of a dilettante. Like he picked up stuff
Hmm.
wherever he was, and that includes languages. Another thing I can sympathize with, and I'm just going to put a little footnote on this conversation by saying that some skepticism had been expressed around the project of identifying certain texts with him based on the linguistic question, because I think there's some sense sometimes on the part of modern people who are classically trained in languages that the same approach to linguistic perfection must be applied to the ancients.
Mm.
But there's no reason at all why somebody from Cilicia couldn't sort of dabble in all of the languages that he was surrounded by. And I say that as somebody who had the privilege and delight of living in Montreal for a long time, and now lives in a bilingual country, Wales, where you do dabble in languages. You pick up vocabulary, you learn basic phrases, and I think it's entirely reasonable to see Theodore as one of those characters that just kind of embraced where he was and dabbled and picked things up. And but one of the things I think he must have picked up and carried with him to the shores of Kent when he arrived was the memory of having stood in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. You know, it would have been by then what 100-ish years old as a temple, and he would have known its grandeur, its splendor, its its awesomeness, and then he would have landed on the shores of windswept Kent long before it was dubbed the Garden of England, and thought, "Oh my goodness, what have I arrived at?" I
Hmm.
mean, if you've ever looked at the parish church at Escombe, which is about 15 minutes away from Durham in County Durham, it's a Saxon. Some have argued possibly pre-Saxon building, but very humble, rough stone church. And you can see that even later Saxon works. Now, if they were building St. Lawrence in Bradford on Avon in the ninth or 10th century, what was Theodore facing in his mind by comparison with what he had come from? Must have been utterly overwhelming or perhaps underwhelming. But I think he seems to have just embraced it and carried on with the sense of theological and spiritual mission, which he clearly took very seriously and never despaired over. Because I mean, you don't run a successful classroom, which is attributed to him by Bede, by Aldhelm, by
Hmm.
various insular ecclesiastics, if you've given up or if you're despondent over your lot.
It's interesting also to think about the character of such a person. We have sort of stereotypes about the Middle Ages, etc. But when I think about this late antique, early medieval period, I really think it resembles our own era. And
Mm,
somebody like Theodore is really a cosmopolitan figure. I think of Chrysostom's teachings about how the Christian has no fatherland. I mean,
mhm,
he's moving from place to place, to Syria, to Italy, to England, etc. It makes me think of other figures like John Cassian, who, I mean, Cassian's like roaming all over the place.
mhm,
Jerome's moving all over. These guys are just moving everywhere. They're doing everything. They're picking up languages. They're doing this and that, and it doesn't seem to bother. At least not from reading your book. I didn't get any impression that Theodore was bothered by saying, okay, I got to get retonsured in the Western style and blah, blah, blah. It's like, whatever. There's something of the universality of the church where you have influences from Irenaeus of Lyon to Ephraim the Syrian, etc., coming together. And it seems natural in a way that today, at least when I talk to people, it doesn't seem natural. Like if I bring up, Abba Isaac of Nineveh, people are like, who is this guy? Who is this
mhm,
weird figure we've never heard of? Who is Didymus the blind? Who is Ishadad of Merv? Who are these people? They're just not known. But I feel like Theodore actually had a broader view of multiple traditions, multiple authentic traditions within the universal church that just doesn't exist in the vast majority of. And I'm not even just talking about lay people. I'm talking about clerics and stuff. People don't know anything about Syriac Christianity. They don't know anything about who is Ephraim, right?
mhm. Yeah, no, not only do I agree, I think that Theodore sort of, in his own person, draws these things together. They become manifest in his own pastoral and intellectual approach. Um, but equally, I think he represents somebody who can well serve to remind us of not just the universality of our faith, but equally the fundamental connections that hold us together across the Mediterranean, across the world. That's more than a romantic notion. So consider the fact that Theodore was certainly, and I'm going to say that, and if a scholar wants to take me on that, I'll be willing to put up the dukes. But um, he was certainly at the Lateran Council of 649 dealing with the heresy of monothelitism. Who was the guiding light or the leading light at the Lateran Council of 649? Maximus the Confessor. Both of their names appear in the Acta. Now, this means that a seemingly obscure character like Theodore has made a direct personal connection with a saint that many of us talk about, even if we haven't read his work, with great sort of admiration.
Hmm.
Maximus the Confessor, and you think, actually, no, these were not just sort of rarefied abstract characters that sort of float like satellites around the church. They were actual sort of fibers in the tapestry in which we wrap ourselves today. And these fibers were tightly woven. They were drawn together and carried from one end of the Mediterranean world to the other. And this is what we inherit. And I think it's utterly incredible.
To what degree, I'm going to ask sort of a parallel question to what we've been talking about, which has to do with how we as contemporary people receive all these people and all this history and all this theology. I have this sort of impression that the way the average Christians in the West today, at least in America, which I'm most familiar with, encounter theologians, for example, is as geniuses, is as
Mhm.
singular figures who, obviously they're reading the Bible and, have some things in common. They believe in Jesus and God and the whole nine yards. But more or less, you have your Augustine, you have Calvin, you have Luther, you have Zwingli, and all these figures are like individuals with their own perspective. And then there are a crowd that kind of follows behind them, right? Whereas when I look at somebody like Theodore, I see a matrix of many figures who are all just sort of overlapping and interlocking. And then that's not to say he doesn't have his own particular genius in a sense, but I don't think he's not like a thinker in some kind of Thomas Carlyle vision of a great thinker. He's a synthetic bringing together many strands. And I think that's kind of, at least for me, that's part of the power of uh, orthodoxy in general, or at least of the more ancient forms of Christianity, is this. it's less about the genius of individual people and more the synthetic outworking of the collective reflection. Do you think that's fair? Am I romanticizing that?
You might be romanticizing, but if you are, it's a seductive vision that I've bought into entirely.
Okay.
I I can't agree more. I mean, the and actually, I would take the implications of what you've just said further and say that the authentic Christian experience must be more like that
Mm.
and less like the alternative. The
Because I don't
reason
know
for
what
that,
how Calvin thought. Like I haven't studied Calvin enough to know how did Calvin think about his own work, right? But it's clear that people
mm,
today receive him as this sort of singular figure, you know.
yep,
And
yep,
he has indebted, blah blah blah. We can do a biographical sketch, but when you look at somebody like Theodore, like in your book is as much about Irenaeus and Ephraim as it is about Theodore.
mhm,
Is that fair to say?
absolutely it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of of drawing it forward, drawing the implications forward into the contemporary Christian world as you just have. But as you say it, it immediately strikes a chord with me, and I think that it's it's an authentic form of Christianity that permits us to interpret or enables us to interpret the work of the Matushka during the Soviet period,
Hmm.
who is not a theological genius, but rather is a spiritual mother in a community that keeps the faith going when it is otherwise under assault or under oppression, and it raises up um, her as a part of the body that recognizes that intrinsic value as being on par with the value of the genius and the value of the person who's simply standing before the votive stand and crossing themselves.
Hmm.
It all kind of matters, and I don't say that just to sort of um, I hope it doesn't sound patronizing. I mean it quite truly, because it authenticates the breadth and the depth of the Christian experience, and Theodore is a prime figure for exemplifying that.
It also gives a lie to the sort of ideal of Christendom, right? If you're saying, I grew up in Tarsus and then I'm going to go to Edessa to some foreign, I mean, in a way, it's a different tradition, the
Mm.
Syriac tradition from that of the Greeks. I mean, obviously, there's borrowing and communion, but it really is different. I mean, you talk about this, the Semitic emphasis, the differences of exegesis. Why don't you sketch for us some of these influences that we've been alluding to? So let's start with Ephraim. What do you think is the contribution of Ephraim to Theodore's worldview, coming from this Syriac background?
Well, one thing that I think sticks out in my mind, and which you'll probably nod your head at when I mention, is the whole sort of imagery of Christ the physician.
Hmm.
Now, Ephraim we could describe as a poetic theologian. There's a phrase I use in the book at some point. He expresses this odium Graecorum, this sort of hatred for the Greeks, and it's clear that he's even as he's saying that he's drawing deeply from a Greek well, but his language is not the language of sort of philosophical theology. Right, his language is that of the poet, the hymnographer, and he's describing the Garden of Paradise and sort of, well, he entirely conscious of the sort of eschatological vision he's putting out? Has he plotted it all meticulously? I doubt it. But his instincts, as expressed in those words, are such that he's painting a picture of the paradisical state from which humanity
Yeah,
emerges and to which humanity is called to return in a very picturesque and wonderful way.
it's very
But
unhermeneutical.
absolutely,
It's not very
absolutely.
hermeneutical. That's one of the glories of going to the Syriac tradition is it's kind of this well of poetic power in
Mm,
otherwise what can be rather, as you said earlier, quite dry stuff.
yeah, yeah, and it's in that respect. I mean, I might be stretching the plausibility of these concepts, but we talk of Antiochene exegetical
Hmm.
style or exegetical tradition as compared to, for example, the Alexandrian approach was more symbolic. We
Mm-hmm.
see that exemplified by the work of Origen. The Antiochene is more sort of literal. When they sort of permit comparisons, they're always sort of drawn from the Old Testament.
Uh-huh.
These styles, although I wouldn't want to overemphasize them, because it makes it seem as if they represent hard categories where these parties and schools were absolute. They're not. However, it's fair to say that one is a more philosophical approach and the other is a more gritty sort of earth up approach when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
reading the texts, and that's reflected in Ephraim's own poetry, and there's a good deal of spiritual instinct there, shaped by the fact that there would have been sort of a Jewish diaspora and a tradition that was different from that which would have been found in the lower right corner of the Mediterranean. As you
Mm-hmm.
move around into Egypt.
There's also these are debates that are not dissimilar to debates we have today about secular literary theory. How do we
No,
approach texts?
yeah,
And
very much
it's there's a lot of gray area to which many figures, like if you think about somebody like Chrysostom, he's clearly taking from both streams. They'll like
so.
pick and choose what he wants from both, and it works because he has the kind of ability to do the Greek rhetorical style and kind of pull it all together.
Yeah, although of course he's typically formed in the sort of Antiochene sort of more literal exegetical tradition. You're quite right in your description of him.
So we have this impact from Theodore's time, formative years, really his younger days among the Syriac Church. And I was
Mhm.
alluding to the comparison with your Soviet example, where clearly there's some chaos going on in Syria. It's no longer really a great place to be, so to speak.
Mhm.
So, for whatever reason, I don't remember. Do you talk about this in the book? Do we know why he left Edessa? Was it
No,
because
I
of
think
warfare or something like that? I'm vague on this detail now.
yeah, it's a bit muddy. I mean, the early to mid 7th century is muddy insofar as you have sort of this last gasp of the Persian Empire,
Mhm.
and then its retreat. You have its swift replacement from 632 on by the emergence of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula. They very quickly push north, and between these two sort of catalysts to change, we just see Theodore seemingly drift from that part of the world, the Euphrates, sort of the Mesopotamian part of the world, to Constantinople. So yes, we can imagine that it is a cause for his migration,
For
but
whatever reason, he ends up in Constantinople, and then for whatever reason, he ends up in Italy, and for whatever reason, he's chosen to come to England. But one of his other primary sources is St. Irenaeus. So, can you speak a little bit about that aspect? Because it seems a little bit on, at first blush, why would Irenaeus of Lyon have such an impact on Theodore of Tarsus? They seem quite distant, compared to somebody like Ephraim, who's next door, so to speak. When you start to look at Irenaeus' work, like why do we have certain texts from him only preserved in Armenian? What is this
yeah.
influence of Irenaeus in like the far east, so to speak? How do we understand that?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and one that is unresolved. And I can speculate, and I probably will because it's amusing. But the fact is, when I first came upon that question, because you can see vestiges of Irenaean thought in the work of Ephraim. I mean,
Mm,
Ephraim makes certain what I'll call Irenaean assumptions, but in conversation with the wonderful Sebastian Brock, professor of Syriac from Oxford, there's no evidence that Against the Heresies, for example, had been translated and was available in Syriac by Ephraim's time. And now I think we have to suspect either it existed in Syriac or else the motifs that emerged from Irenaeus's slightly unwieldy work had a huge effect, well beyond even the language barrier. Certainly, you see those words, as we well know. Everybody always cites Athanasius when they give expression to what Norman Russell calls the exchange formula: God became man in order that man
Mhm.
might become God.
Which
Um,
scandalizes people to this day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? I actually used it in a lecture I was giving in Montreal once, and one of the audience members shook his fist in disgust and said that that was, it sounded like New Age theology to him. I said, well, if by New Age you mean second century, then sure, I'll give that to you.
We should
But
pause there because this is actually something that comes up quite a lot. I've had people who are like very well educated in theology and things tell me that this is bad, and if Athanasius said it, then he's wrong.
mm,
And what I think people don't understand is that this perspective isn't some weird thing about Athanasius, or it's not like Irenaeus came up with it and then Athanasius picked up on it and it's kind of a fringe thing. This is like core and central doctrine to the whole rest of Christian history. And if people
oh,
don't know about it today, it's a sort of accident of, I don't know, a deformation of the tradition that they've received. Is that unfair?
fundamentally, no, not at all. Fundamentally and absolutely, you're right. To the point where I would say, if I was to now, it could be somebody's already done this work, and if they have, I hope they get in touch with you. But the, I've often thought in terms of taking that theme further and exploring why it becomes so much a part of the heart of Eastern thought, and unquestionably exists in the West, in the Latin West, but does not take on the same weight. So, for example, and I love citing this, but the traditional prayer at the commixture, when the priest in the traditional Latin rite places a drop of water into the chalice before taking it to the altar at the offertory. He says, "O God, who didst create and yet more wonderfully renew the dignity of the substance of man, grant that by the mystery of this water and wine we may become partakers of his divinity, who didst vouchsafe to become a partaker of our humanity."
Mm,
Now, if that isn't Irenaeus to the word, I don't know what is.
mm.
And yet, you do not see a development of that idea, that exchange, into deification, into theosis, the way you do among the Greeks, and even further afield.
I have a special interest in John Scotus Eriugena.
Oh
And
yes,
Eriugena is a weird exceptional figure where he does do all these things. He's like fully aware of all of this.
hmm,
But when he makes his intervention, for example, I'm working on an article about this right now. When he makes this intervention with Gottschalk, the French bishops don't know what to make of the intervention. They're kind of
right,
baffled and confused. And the fact that, Eriugena is the favorite of the king kind of insulates him from any
hmm,
negative consequence, but they just take
right,
his work on divine predestination and just kind of thanks, but no thanks.
hmm,
We're just going to leave this and we're going to make a vague statement that doesn't make anybody happy, and we're going to imprison Gottschalk in a monastery, and now it's all settled or whatever. And I just
right,
I think about that now. Why don't the bishops accept what Eriugena is saying?
hmm,
Why doesn't Eriugena have the legacy that Aquinas or somebody has? Because I don't think Aquinas is, mentally superior to Eriugena. It's not like he's so much more brilliant than Eriugena was. So what
hmm.
is it about? What is it about this particular teaching that Eriugena was transmitting, as you say, from the Celtic tradition back into Western, continental Europe? What's the disconnect there?
Yeah. I mean, I have sort of romantic answers that I sort of love to proffer in my own mind. I'm very hesitant to make them public because I'm sure that they could be easily dismantled. But if I were to put forward a hypothesis, I think there must be something in the Eastern intellectual soil, and by something I mean something tangible. There must be some kind of philosophical idea that reacts with those words, those sort of words of exchange, that means the plant that emerges looks different to the plant that emerges in the West.
Oh, it might literally
That
be a sort of cultural, linguistic sort of convergence there, an issue about it being expressed in Latin per se.
could be absolutely. but I think honestly it will require more exploration
We do
because
see
it
that
does.
with the whole Trinity issue,
Mhm.
We see that in several issues. What about the reverse question when it comes to these things of Irenaeus that are inherited by so many? To what degree do you think that can be traced backwards through like Ignatius, Polycarp, John?
I think
Because
when you look at
Irenaeus is from Smyrna, correct?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So to what degree is what Irenaeus is saying his own developed theology versus something that he's synthesizing from his milieu?
I wish I was more adept as a philosophical historian, but I think that when you look at, I mean, Polycarp is a disciple of John the Apostle.
Yeah.
John the Apostle's gospel is the one, that is clearly distinct from the other three.
And
And
John was a kind of stupid fisherman, according to Chrysostom. He was just a
yeah,
rustic who was so base, he was almost an irrational animal, like the fish that he was working with. And somehow he has this teaching that overcomes all the philosophers, right?
mm,
And that
yeah,
reminds me so much of this thing from Ephraim about, I wonder to what degree is this are these ideas being transmitted from particular people, or is this just part of the background tradition that would have come from John? You know,
mm.
the Syriac mentality is the same as the one of Irenaeus because it's coming from the same source. Am I drawing a genealogy that's unsupportable?
No, I'm fascinated by this, and in fact, I mean, you're sort of provoking for the thought in me by saying those, by making those statements. The the idea, I mean, I suppose I've always been satisfied to assume that Irenaeus is this bright light, but a bright light that sort of appears because of the context from which he emerges.
Hmm.
So it's not like any bright light exists entirely on its own, but for whatever reason, his words carry a force that, for example, his contemporaries or even his predecessors don't. I mean, you don't. I
I mean,
mean,
he's
he
not
is
dissimilar to Theodore. He's a Greek coming to the West. I mean, Cassian, it's the
exactly.
same way, right? You
Yeah.
got Cassian, you got Theodore, you've got Irenaeus. I mean, I'm sure there's others that I'm forgetting, but these are like the big
Yeah.
three in my mind of bringing the tradition westward,
Mhm. Yeah.
along with
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
blessed apostle himself, of course.
You get, um, you know, I come back to the fact that it's in Irenaeus that you find the words you do first, the exchange, the words of
Hmm.
exchange, and those are in the preface to the fifth book of Against the Heresies. Prior to him, you don't actually find anything similar. You can see how you can sort of see the ethos, or
Hmm.
feel the ethos as it emerges from texts of a similar period and area, but
He's at
for
least the
whatever
beginning
reason,
of the documented record of this kind of a notion,
precisely,
at the very least,
precisely.
right?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it would just take further textual work, really, to build a picture of how he ends up being the sort of particular that emerges from a general
And talk more
context.
about that. Flesh that idea out for people that aren't familiar. So, for Irenaeus, the way salvation works is that Christ takes on and recapitulates all of human history and thereby alters it, right?
Almost, and consequently gives us almost every sort of poetic motif of the Middle Ages in terms of how we describe so much in terms of the life of
I
Christ.
mean,
But
this
yes,
is going back to the issue of catechesis because what does God do on the cross? I mean, it's a Latin Holy Week, right? This is widely debated among people. you know
absolutely.
and when I
And
tell
then
people that God, Jesus came to liberate us from this evil world, people look at me like I'm giving some different religion. What is it about this evil world? I mean, that's Pauline language, right? What is it about recapitulate? What does it mean to recapitulate all of human history? This just isn't, at least in America, at least in the sort of evangelical milieu that I grew up in, this isn't something that people talk about. Like, what do you mean recapitulates all of human history?
maybe my own background was more liberal in the true sense of that word, because none of this came across as scandalous, but it always came across as enlightening.
Mm.
And so the notion of recapitulation is, for those who don't know, the the idea that, well, it's the Greek. anekephaliosis. It almost literally means re-heading. So you look at Adam and Eve as the first heads of the human
Hmm.
race, and they lay down the template by which we all then operate. Because they brought death and exile upon themselves, that's part of the template. And so when we take on our or when we manifest, our particular version of the template, we're manifesting the same sort of errors that have been introduced to it. So that runs across the course of our lives from the moment of conception. The fetus is already moving towards its own end,
Hmm.
but that's not what God desires for his creation, for his children. He did not create for death, and therefore something needs to happen in order to reset the template.
Now that's already a controversial point, which to you
Mm.
and I, as part of our tradition, we just assume that. Of course, it says in wisdom, God is not the maker of death. So of course, death came through sin, and sin through one man, right? But a lot of people believe that death was created by God, and that there was death even in the Edenic state, right? So this cosmic picture of death being the sort of accidental entry into human history is simply not known by many people. So when you add
Well,
that
I guess.
onto this issue of recapitulation, it starts to sound like a completely different religion, and maybe it is, from what people
Mhm.
are familiar with.
You're quite right. I mean, the one sort of condition I would put on what you just said is the fact that if you look at the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 articles, I cannot remember which article it is,
Mm,
but they can be accused of being overly Calvinistic by sort of Anglo Catholics, for example. Yet the article on predestination begins with the words, "Predestination to life is the everlasting purpose of God,"
hmm
which actually kind of lays the groundwork for what you just identified as being, of the essence of our tradition,
Yeah.
of the Orthodox tradition. So there is some notion within sort of a broader Christian vision that God creates for life, and ultimately, then to return to Irenaeus, we recognize that we break the template, we break that created purpose. So then coming back to recapitulation, it takes only the logos that takes on flesh, only the word of God taking on flesh, um, makes it possible for that template to sort of find its recreation, its reestablishment in perfect order, as opposed to this imperfect order. And so Christ then moves through every stage of human experience and human existence. So Irenaeus would attribute to Jesus, infancy, childhood, to use, our medical biological terms, puberty, teenage years, adulthood, and
Yeah.
ultimately old age. That's symbolic, of course, because if Jesus was just in his mid 30s when he's crucified, then it's not exactly old age by our standards, but it's that notion that he passes through these stages
Yeah. He
of
reaches maturity. He reaches an
yeah,
adult state.
yeah. So, and it's then that he has experienced everything we can possibly experience. The only thing he hasn't given into is sin, and thereby he recapitulates, he reheads
Hmm.
each of those states and makes it possible for us now to um, live out our existence according to the new template.
We've discussed the background of Theodore, about his
Mhm.
influence from Syriac, Latin, Greek traditions, coming into contact with Celtic traditions. In a way, he's one of these figures that really touches every corner of church tradition that existed during his time, right? But
Mhm.
we haven't talked a lot about his impact. So the Venerable Bede writes about him, and he's honored in the Church of England and the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. But we don't really have Theodore of Tarsus as a figure of equal standing with his peer at the time, Maximus Confessor, or with Irenaeus, or with Ephraim. What do you think? What's blocking the reception of Theodore? What's Theodore's impact, and why is he not so well known?
That's a question I've asked myself numerous times. I mean, when you consider the fact that at the time of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the Pope wrote that he had hoped that his brother bishop and philosopher of Great Britain, Theodore, might attend the council on the basis that he was the only living person who knew the monothelete question firsthand.
Hmm.
It's really quite incredible. This means that at least in the West, this figure is known and well known enough that the Pope should have desired his attendance at the Sixth Ecumenical Council. Now, for whatever reason, he could have almost literally disappeared from the history books after that. Even that quote is one that gets dredged up, but is not one that's sort of plastered on the side of book spines, although it probably should be. I think there are a number of reasons for it. One, I called Theodore a bit of a dilettante earlier. I mean, he is not sort of this rigorous kind of bright light intellect as Maximus is, right? He is somebody, you call him a synthesizer. I love that because I think that's exactly what he was. He's drawing on knowledge and he's turning it into something he can communicate to the people under his care.
We
So he's
have his
actually
penitential, which there's like a Twitter account that tweets random quotes from, and it often seems a bit rigorous and harsh. This penitential of
yeah,
Theodore.
I actually spoke about the penitential at last year's meeting of the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, because my take on the penitential, which is, for listeners, one of the most enduring and obvious legacies that Theodore hands on. It bears his name. It's the Theodore. It's the penitential of Saint Theodore, and in it, the teachings and the words are attributed directly to him as recorded by one of his disciples. Now, the thing about those teachings is that, first of all, they draw heavily, almost exclusively, on Eastern fathers.
Hmm.
Everything that Theodore has to say about sin and about repentance and reconciliation is based on, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus, Basil, many others. I mean, those are just the obvious. The Cappadocians are easy to recall, but the fact is, it's a significantly Eastern piece of work. Having said that, its nature is fundamentally optimistic. Let us consider, although that Twitter account to which you refer, actually, I find humorous because they've actually got the wrong century listed as the and I wish they would change it. I sent them a message, but to no avail. Um, Having said that, the if you hold up the penitential teaching in Theodore's penitential against today's culture of condemnation, when people say the wrong thing um, or make the wrong joke at the wrong time, and it happens to get picked up by somebody's mobile phone, and they then get
Hmm.
dismantled. Their entire lives get condemned and dismantled online. We show far, far less mercy than is manifest in that work. That work, in fact, presupposes that everything is forgivable.
Hmm.
And if you read the penitential, I mean, it's full of sexual sins, the likes of which um, the internet um, couldn't have even envisaged, or if it did, only in the darkest corners.
Yeah.
Um, and if you consider that these things were imagined or heard by a priest confessor, and that the priest confessor simply said okay, and then returned with a penitential judgment on them that assumed forgivability, I think it's a remarkable piece. So it really depends on how you read it.
It's also
You
one
know,
of these areas that's kind of unusual because when it comes to pastoral concern, I mean, this is a domain for pastors. Usually, people who are not pastors are not reflecting and thinking at great length about how do we tend to the flock because it's sort of an art of the people in this particular technical field of spiritual direction, et cetera, et cetera. And when you
Yeah.
think about a philosopher, I mean, a lot of philosophers are not dealing with, I did something wrong with the animal in the barn type
Hmm.
questions. They're not that gritty and concrete. But if you think about it, such a man as Theodore, who has been all over the world, I presume, maybe I presume too much. I don't think that Rome of the seventh century was a particularly pristine place.
Mm.
I don't think that Constantinople of that time was particularly utopian, in terms of its social character. He's probably seen, heard, and I don't know what he's done, but he's familiar with the way of the world, right?
Hmm.
And he's responsible for those people's souls. And he can't just give some kind of abstract, teaching about the nature of sin, right? How do you actually address the real sins of people, real people in front of you? That's a
Yeah.
difficult task.
And I think it may, yeah, you've nailed it really. I think it's never going to garner the same kind of glory that the sort of um, philosophical genius of Maximus is going to gain,
Yeah.
right? And hence, Theodore is, I mean, at the end of the day, he's a pastor, teacher, albeit a brilliant one, a pastor and a teacher in the furthest flung reaches of the known world at that time,
Mm.
and easy therefore to forget. Now, on top of that, you have a textual problem, and that is there is nothing other than the penitential really attributable to him. A couple of poems, some correspondence between him and Wilfrid, the saintly Archbishop of York, who had been estranged from Theodore for a good many years of Theodore's own episcopate. Um, but I mean, none of that lends itself to being able to nail down the thought of the man
Hmm.
until I think it was 1993. Michael Lapidge published the joint work of he and Bernard Bischoff, a paleographer, which was really the fruit of 60 years' labor on the part of Bischoff. Bischoff had discovered in, I think it was Milan, a manuscript which included texts that referred on numerous points to Theodore,
Hmm.
and he realized that these texts had come from Canterbury, that they were reflecting Theodore's teaching on various parts of Scripture in the classroom. And I mean, this was exciting, but it wasn't announced until after the end of World War II. And so there's a famous paper in German in which Bischoff announces the existence of this manuscript. And it's then a further, 30, 40 years before it becomes an edition. And so that edition exists as the biblical commentaries of the Canterbury of Theodore and Hadrian, or something like that. I
Yeah.
can't remember what its proper title is. But simultaneous to the release of that, Jane Stevenson, um, through a number of links that she herself makes, realizes that this hitherto anonymous text, and which is we now call the Laterculus Malalianus, um, could be in some ways measured against the concrete evidence that we now had in the form of the biblical commentaries. And not only do I think ultimately her argument held water, I think it was a brilliant argument, and in some ways ahead of its time, because a lot of the evidence has only furthered what she was first laying down in her edition, called the Laterculus Malalianus in the School of Archbishop Theodore. And it was that text that I ended up writing about. In itself, it's not a work of brilliance, but there's something beautiful about it. I mean, essentially, one could see it as Theodore sort of deploying some of his trans-Mediterranean formation to a kind of exegetical, almost whimsical exegetical work on the life of Christ. But in so doing, he's using the Malaline Chronicle from about 50 years earlier than his own life. Chronicle is a historical text. It's just literally in this year, Emperor so and so did this, and
Hmm.
then in that year, this happened. That's a chronicle. So he takes the chronicle originally composed by John Malalas, and elaborates on it by elucidating the nature of Christ's life. And I think in that respect, it's incredibly insightful and
Hmm.
quite an exciting text to read.
How would you summarize his Christology? We've had Jordan Daniel Wood on the podcast to talk about Maximus Confessor and his Christology, other figures like Isaac of Nineveh in the past. What do you think is the Christology of Theodore, if you could put it in a paragraph?
I could put it in one word: restoration.
Mm-hmm.
The restoration of humankind. Theodore of Tarsus, I wrestled with that text for so long until I was on a coach ride over to Walsingham, which is a great Marian shrine here in Britain. I was on a coach ride and I was reading a paper, and it was a paper about recapitulation, which was only coincident to what I was supposed to be doing on the Liturculus. And I went back to the Liturculus and counted the number of appearances in Latin of the word restoration or recapitulation. And it's a long time ago now, but let's say there was like 27 appearances
Mm-hmm.
of this word. And I was overwhelmed. I thought, Theodore has a clear project here. And ultimately, when he talks about the restored face of humanity, he's talking about something that is akin to sort of the return of Adam and Eve to paradise, such as you find it described in Ephraim's poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite a remarkable picture, one that's underrated, but one that from a spiritual point of view can bring great joy. Laying aside the academic purpose.
We've spoken before also in the podcast with David Bentley Hart about apokatastasis. And it seems to me
Mhm.
that there's two sorts of notions of restoration, which today we might want to draw some comparisons to, but that actually have separate genealogies. Is that fair? They're actually distinct
Mhm.
notions. This restoration that Theodore is talking about, or Ephraim's talking about, is not the same thing as the apokatastasis of the Egyptians, or is it?
It's easy to connect them, but it's not the same, not deliberately the same in any
Because you were
case.
talking about the restoration of humanity or the human image, right?
That's right.
Which is separate from the idea of the restoration of the cosmos per se.
It
These are
is
distinct notions.
absolutely, but now I could just leave that sentence
Yeah.
there and allow the listener to interpret. The thing is, I know there's some danger to that, but I don't think it's a difficult jump to make from the kind of restoration of the human image that we see in Ephraim and Theodore,
Hmm.
to the kind of thing that we talk about when we explore apokatastasis or
Hmm.
apokatastasis. I mean, it's
I don't really speak Greek. I just kind of say things. So I don't pronounce
that's,
things. You can call it liturculus. I'll call it laterculus or whatever. I'll mess it up.
I don't know if you have met or spoken with or read the work of Father Aidan Kimmel, but he's very much about apokatastasis,
Yeah.
and
Big fans
he's
of
the
Father Kimmel. We love Father Al. Great man.
okay. Well, good. We ran some interviews online between him and John Milbank, him and
Hmm.
I can't remember who all we spoke with, but Robin Perry and Douglas Campbell. And they were fascinating discussions. But the first thing we needed to do was clear up how he was going to, as an American, pronounce apokatastasis. And it took time. So,
I'm just going to say apokatastasis because I'm a barbarian. But I think that the issue, like we could say, we today, contemporaries, we could say, well, the human has this particular cosmological role, biblically
mm,
speaking, over this cosmos. That's why the cosmos has fallen, because man has fallen, and man has this
mhm,
particular role. We could talk about it as there's different ways we could express this role, but it's a particular role that has an impact on the whole cosmos. So we could argue, I think, that so goes man, so goes the cosmos. But it
mhm.
seems like with Ephraim and with Theodore, at least based on reading this book, and you can correct me, it's really focused on the human image in particular and the relationship of the God man to man. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. The thing is, on precisely the same premises on which they build that picture, You also, with no real shift or leap in logic at all, see its application to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden and the cross, right? How the cross recapitulates the tree of man's downfall, so that it becomes the tree of man's salvation. I mean, it's and
So man might be seen to sum up the cosmos in a
yeah,
sense.
exactly, yeah,
Mm.
and consequently, that's where I think more academic work would need to be taken on the sort of connection between um, I'm going to make up a term, but naive restorationists and knowing restorationists. In other words, those who
Yeah.
would speak in more originistic terms compared to those who would limit their language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I wonder too also about the pastoral aspect of these things. I mean, you're a pastor. How does this impact what you do? I mean, you're in Britain, you're in the land of Theodore. So and your church, is it named after Theodore of Tarsus also?
Of course it is. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, it's good. So you've got the whole 9 yards, but to what degree there seems to have been, at least as far as I understand, a historical tendency to reduce the gospel message to a kind of moralizing um, device,
Mhm.
to reduce it to, look, God sees everything you do, he knows everything you do, you can't hide from him, you better get in line or else. And when you mess up, you come to the church and we can figure it out, right? And maybe for people that are knee deep in muck and dying left and right and living terrible, miserable, short, épouvantable lives, that's workable. But there seems to be a lot of people seems to start to get upset when you break with that and you start to talk about other things. They get scared because it's like, well, that's not what I was taught. That's not, what about do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Let me say that I I mean, I'm excited to answer the kind of question you've just posed to me. I know that the Forms podcast is not about feeling and sentiment, but on the basis that I heard you admit to David Bentley Hart that you'd cried once or
Oh, we love feeling and sentiment over here.
good, good. Then
We're fully
in
sentimental.
which case I'm going to go for it. The fact is, I feel utterly driven amidst my pastoral ministry by the kind of study I've made of Theodore of Tarsus, and I mean that very literally. First of all, academic pursuits for me have never uh, been sort of isolated from the ministry, from the idea of a pastoral vocation. But in very real terms, I I hit the ground literally. I go from my house. I walk the streets. If I'm not doing dad stuff, I walk the streets in my cassock. Um, that makes me visible. And I feel emboldened to do that, not just because of a sense of responsibility, but because of a sense that Theodore did it, because of a sense that where I am in South Wales, St. David did it, and Illtyd, and Tylo, and all of these wonderful Welsh saints. And if they could do it, so should I be. Now, that might sound like just sort of a romantic notion, and it probably is, but it also is quite timely in the sense that, we live in a world that is utterly bereft of spiritual information in any authentic sense. And I hope that when I wear that cassock, when I am out there as a visible figure, I am as authentic and as I can possibly be. In other
Hmm.
words, I hate airs and graces. I'm glad that my Byzantine cassock, my Russian cassock, in fact, folds up. That I can roll the sleeves up because I'll happily garden in it. Um, the these are necessary facets of the ministry, and you can well see Theodore doing precisely the same thing. Having said that, it also has the moral implications, or carries the moral implications you've already alluded to, because when you encounter people, they have expectations of really a Calvinistic kind of church, one
Yeah.
that is not very attractive. There's an evangelical church in Cardiff. I won't sort of say where precisely because, listeners might hear and think I'm being critical, but, you know, as seems to be a thing here, there's a big, poster, meters in dimension, that's visible from the street that talks about, Christ dying to save us to the uttermost or something like that.
Hmm.
And every time I see it, I can't help but think, how many drivers see that per day? And how many of those drivers does it mean a single thing? And the answer to that question
Yeah.
is, to the first half, probably hundreds, thousands. To the second, zero. It doesn't mean anything
Hmm.
because all of those words they carry so much negative baggage, and ultimately, even with definition, they therefore are rendered meaningless. People don't have a clue what sin is, but people do have a sense that their existential lives are dissonant with something. I think, the Welsh youth that mess up the city centre streets of Cardiff on Friday nights with the remnants of their binge drinking aren't doing that because they're very happy with themselves.
Yeah.
And to walk among the people, those people or any people, and not to have to condemn anything, as distasteful as I might find that lifestyle, that's a personal thing. I'm not condemning them or anything. I'm simply there. And I hope I can do that because of an understanding of what, say, Christ did, that is perpetuated through the work of somebody like Theodore of Tarsus and all of the early saints that tread this ground before me. So yeah, there are direct moral implications, and I think that what those implications are um, include hope
Hmm.
and a sense that actually what we carry to the people is a true gospel and not a list of moral judgments.
We're coming towards the end of the allotted time, and when I look at the works of yours that have been published that I've read, we have the Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy. Was
That's
it
right.
the title?
Yep.
We have the Orthodox Basics. We have the Theodore book. And I guess, if you don't want to answer this, you don't have to. I'll just speak for myself. And if you want to give a rejoinder, that's fine. So I grew up in the church and among Christian people. And I know that there's a lot of good work that gets done, life saving work, life giving work. I know that for a lot of people, their evangelical youth pastor is one of the only people that's going to show up to the hospital when the kid is sick. I'm very familiar with all of these details. But it's hard for me not to look at the state of the church and of the world and of what you just described in terms of these Christian statements meaning nothing and not see the religion as wrecked, essentially,
Mhm.
as a wreckage. And so something that I recognized in your work is this idea that we need to bring to people anew what is Christianity? Like, who is
Mhm.
Jesus? What is the gospel? Who is God? These questions. Do you think, is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is fair. I want to be cautious when I say that, though, because my experience of sort of the evangelical witness
It's not just them. I
is,
mean, look at the Catholic Church with all the abuses and the scandal. Look at the
yeah,
Orthodox
yeah,
Church with the war in Ukraine. We have all this stuff going on where our religion is just absurd. Like,
yeah.
it doesn't make sense. It doesn't speak to people anymore. If you were to go back 80 years, people would have been more, I don't know, inured with a kind of cultural Christianity, and
Mhm.
so it would have spoken to them on that level. But people today are not even culturally Christian,
Right.
so it's just this weird thing to them. And to me, that's an opportunity to represent the gospel without all the baggage. But I don't know if
Ye-
that's how the way that you see it, because you're working, concretely with your mission and with your parish and everything.
Yeah, I I can't. I mean, audio will not express
We have
the
full agreement.
we do, but with genuine excitement because we can always bemoan the era in which we're born, but this is our era. And how can I possibly complain when I look at the 7th century and a man who had to sort of flee his home, how many times before he ended
Yeah.
up in the furthest reaches of civilization? And I think here I am in South Wales. I enjoy numerous luxuries that have hitherto been unknown, and and all I have to do is attest to a compassionate, merciful, loving God who is personal, who actually is concerned with not just our well-being in a collective sense, but with our well-being as his individual children. And I think actually that shouldn't be too hard a message to convey,
Yeah.
despite the best efforts of the institutions, whether they're evangelical, Catholic, Orthodox, or whatever.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I mean, to be honest, as utterly dark and yeah, as utterly dark as our own post-Christian era seems to be, I can see it as an incredible sort of opportunity.
I also see it as providential, and maybe this is I'm overly I've taken Rue Daru to the max. I've maxed out on Soloviev, right? But I
Right.
just fully agree with him in lectures on Godmanhood, you know,
Mhm.
about this historical problem of the falling of the church. Because to me, that's one of his insights that's the most poignant is this idea of the church facing collectively, historically, the same temptations of Christ, for example, for temporal power.
Mhm.
But whereas Christ had victory, the church has, in many cases, fallen to that temptation. And so you get Christendom and you get, the episcopal hierarchy collaborating with political forces of repression, violence, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about that?
I I find it a very appealing notion, and I don't doubt for one moment its cosmic potential.
Or Father
Um,
Sergi about the history rendering a judgment, right? That the
yeah,
judgment against the sort of quote unquote Christian nostalgic period that we have in mind, it's actually has been rendered judgment against. It's been judged, and it's been
mm.
judged unworthy.
I just don't know how far. Yeah, I would love to actually have another conversation about this, not least because I think it is um, it's worthy of a deeper exploration,
Mm,
deeper than I've given it, because I believe in the premise, the fundamental premise that motivates Soloviev to even think that way. I believe that history can be deployed in to divine ends that way. I believe that the church can reflect back, much like a great work of art.
in the fullness of time. I mean, think about Christ coming into the context of uh, the first century, you know.
Mm,
And that's the fullness of time. In a way,
right.
the Greeks had already, and this is something that really like separates, I think, our tradition from a lot of other traditions, is that we're willing to embrace that fullness of time concept. We're like, the Greeks are essential to Christianity just as Judaism is.
Mm,
There's no Christianity without the Greeks. Sorry, it doesn't. You don't have any
right.
gospel without those Gentiles. Even if we're going to rhetorically, inveigh against them as Ephraim does. But it's like it's part of the whole bringing to fruition this messianic apocalyptic revelation.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe I'm just off kilter, but that's to me the element that's the most missing is the apocalyptic. We got to bring back the apocalypse. Do you have any thoughts about the apocalypse?
I do, and I think it's a big motivator for me. And if you could actually see the titles on the books behind me, almost all of them are about apocalypse, particularly as conceived in the early Middle Ages, because it's a huge concern, and what it means has great implications for us in our lives, the way we live our lives. By which I do not mean anything conventional in terms of the sheep and the goats, in terms of how people conceive of judgment, but rather just how things find their consummation. And that is, I think, a very early medieval or late antique concern.
So bring it back to Theodore and to the end of the book. Frame for us Theodore's relationship to the apocalypse.
This actually motivated my the research I took up almost immediately upon completing that, and it is the idea that history itself at that time, the writing of history that is, had had um, an essentially eschatological purpose, meaning it was interested in apocalypse. It was interested in the consummation of the fulfillment of all things. Where did time lead? Time led to the New Jerusalem. The end of time. I think I talk in the book about the Sexitates Mundi, the 6 ages of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's disagreement among fathers as to which age we might have been in at a given
Mm-hmm.
time. And Augustine, of course, in the City of God, very much um, shoots down any literal interpretation of 1,000 year ages and all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. So it's a concern, but from Theodore's point of view, and his seems to be a very sort of mature take on it, meaning, he would accept what Augustine has to say about eschewing a literal interpretation of 1,000 years. But Theodore is about drawing history to an end, which is an end that entails restoration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of harkens back then to what we were talking about 10 minutes ago in terms of what kind of restoration, one of the two. But his is very much uh, a restoration of consummation. That which humanity goes through across the ages finds its fulfillment ultimately in this sort of paradisical day, this eighth day, to steal
Mm-hmm.
from origin, to say that actually, yeah, our fulfillment is in the font. You know,
And that has to do also with the Laterculus and the whole calendrical dispute in
yeah,
Britain and his own calendrical study in Constantinople, right? This
indeed
whole
it does.
the calendar, the church calendar, right? Uh, has to do. I mean, I think that's a place where all these things converge, right? I mean, we're running up here on Easter as we're speaking. I think it's going to be just something that's on everybody's mind as we're going into Holy Week. That this conception of the end of time and the apocalyptic revelation of God in Christ. It's at this sort of we're nearing the summit, so to speak, of the cycle. And it's interesting also to think about how radically different this is from the anacyclosis, from this just sort of repetitive,
Yeah.
temporal, demonic, diabolical cycle of society just constantly churning. And that's something that a lot of Christians have taken on as part of their common sense, right? And I think that's also something we have to break from.
I think one antidote to that, uh, yeah, to that error, is the experience of Pascha in the Orthodox context. I mean, because nothing speaks of consummation better than our first shouts of Christos voskreise. It to proclaim that Christ has risen.
Well, I appreciate your time, Father. I'm happy to have you come on again and talk about things in the future. I know you have a lot of things you've been working on. Is there anything you want to tell the people about before we wrap up?
Only to maybe keep their eyes on orthodoxexchange.net. It's simply the repository of the things that I'm working on. That includes my academic work, but equally some of the things that I'm trying to produce in order to get into people's hands. So the Catechism book is one such piece, but there are more forthcoming. So we've started a series. I say we. I won't say who I'm
You
working
have
with.
a podcast. You have I didn't even know this. You have the Orthodox podcast
Yeah.
under my roof.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so I'm going to have to subscribe to this. Why didn't you tell me about this before?
Well, I guess I'm a bit understated.
You're too humble. This piety stuff is really. Well, I'm looking forward to listening to that.
Good, good. Yesterday's the one that's just gone up is of I think you'll find of interest, and I've got a second conversation with that guy, Joshua Brown,
Oh,
coming
good.
up. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you ever come back to France and you're in the southern reaches, let me know.
I will certainly do that. I will